More than 11,000 people once lived at the very top of the world, in a town the Soviet Union built to prove a single point. That nothing, not distance, not the endless dark of the polar winter, not even the Arctic itself could stop it. Today, fewer than half of them are left. The empty apartments outnumber the people who remain. Entire buildings stand dark and silent, their windows missing or boarded over, the bright paint that once made them cheerful, now cracking off the concrete and peeling away in the wind. You would assume the cold finally won, that the Arctic did what the Arctic does and pushed the humans back out, the way it has pushed out almost everyone who ever tried to live this far north. It didn't. What emptied this city was something far quieter than a blizzard, something you cannot see from a satellite, something that left no ruins and no bodies. A single line in a budget that one day, somewhere far to the south, simply stopped being there. This is Tiksi, and almost everything you think you know about why it died is wrong. Here is the story most people tell themselves about a place like this. It sits at roughly 71 degrees north, on the cold edge of the Laptev Sea, where the mighty Lena River finally drains into the Arctic Ocean. The sun disappears for weeks at a time in winter. The temperature falls well below -40, cold enough that exposed skin begins to freeze in minutes, and the air itself feels solid in your lungs. So of course people left. Who could possibly want to live there? It sounds obvious. It's also the very first thing we have to take apart. Because for more than half a century, people did not merely survive in Tiksi. They built a life there that, by the standards of the Soviet North, was genuinely good. When the town was founded in the early 1930s, it was not an accident, and it was not a punishment. It was a strategy. The Soviet Union wanted to turn the Northern Sea route, the shipping passage that runs along its entire Arctic coastline, into a working highway of the sea. And to do that, it needed harbors carved into the ice. Tiksi, sitting precisely where the enormous Lena River meets the open ocean, became one of the most important stops on the whole route. None of this was built on empty land. The far north of what is now the Sakha Republic had been crossed for centuries by indigenous peoples, herders and hunters who had learned, over countless generations, to move with the Arctic instead of fighting it. The Soviet town was a completely different idea. It did not adapt to the place. It was dropped onto the place, fully formed, and ordered to hold. So Moscow poured money into the frozen ground. During the Second World War, the port handled Soviet Arctic convoys, supply runs that crept along the top of the world to stay clear of enemy submarines. And in the decades that followed, Tiksi reached its peak. Ships arrived from around the world. People who lived through those years described deliveries of food and goods you could not find anywhere else in the entire country, delicacies that simply never reached an ordinary Soviet town. There were schools full of children, a working seaport, scientific stations measuring the polar atmosphere, 2 military air bases, one of them a launch point for long-range strategic bombers. At 71 degrees north, in a spot where the textbook said no city should be able to function, the Soviet Union had built a real one, with more than 11,000 people inside it. To live in Tiksi at its height was to live a life carved entirely out of logistics. In the deep of winter, the sun does not rise at all for weeks, and the town runs on artificial light and stubbornness. The wind comes off the Laptev Sea with nothing to slow it, scouring the streets between the apartment blocks. And yet, there was a strange comfort in it. The heat ran, the shelves were stocked. A child could grow up here believing, with perfectly good reason, that the state would always keep the lights on. That belief was the real foundation of the city, more than the concrete, more than the permafrost. And here is the detail that still holds true, even now, even after everything. Shrunken to a fraction of what it once was, no settlement on the entire planet that sits this far north has more people living in it than Tiksi. Against every rule of geography and every instinct of common sense, it remains the most populous place at the very top of the world. So the idea that the Arctic made it impossible to live here? That collapses the moment you look at it directly. People lived here, and lived well, for generations. Which forces the real question into the open. If the climate did not change, and it did not nearly enough to empty an entire city, then what actually did? Subscribe to Impossible Lands right now, because the force that emptied this city is almost the exact opposite of the force that is suddenly dragging the world's largest powers back toward it. The answer arrives with a single year, 1991. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the machine that kept Tiksi alive did not break down slowly. It was switched off. The entire reason the town existed to serve a vast state project, moving supplies along the Arctic coast, no longer had a state standing behind it. The subsidies that paid for the heat, the deliveries, the salaries, the flights in and out, they thinned, and then in many cases, they simply ended. This is the hidden fragility of almost every Soviet Arctic town. They were never designed to be self-sustaining. They were outposts of a planned economy, kept alive by a constant, deliberate flow of resources from the center, a system sometimes called Northern Delivery. As long as the orders kept coming down from Moscow, a place like Tiksi could function at the very edge of the habitable world. The moment the orders stopped, the arithmetic underneath it was exposed for what it had always been: impossible without the subsidy. Understand what that actually means in a place like this. Tiksi could not feed itself. It could not heat a single building with anything found nearby. Every essential thing, the fuel, the food, the medicine, the spare parts, had to be carried in from somewhere far away, by a system that had just ground to a halt. The military bases wound down, the bomber base was abandoned to the snow, the traffic through the port dried up because the cargo it had been built to handle was no longer being sent. And so the people did the only rational thing left to them. They left, not in a single panic, not all at once. Family by family, winter by winter, anyone who could find a way south took it. The population did not crash in a day. It drained slowly enough that, from the inside, you might never have noticed the exact moment it became impossible to reverse. Getting anything in or out is its own ordeal. For most of the year, the sea is locked solid under ice, and the town leans on sparse flights and unreliable winter roads. Then, for a brief window in the warmest weeks, the water opens, barges push up toward the coast, and close to a year's worth of supplies has to arrive before the cold slams the door shut again. Everything about life here is timed against the freeze. What they left behind is the strangest part of all. Walk through Tiksi today and you are walking through a city that has too many buildings and not enough people to fill them. Apartment blocks raised for thousands now stand mostly hollow. In some of them, residents say, if you leave a single window open through the winter, the cold simply moves in and takes the room frost climbing the inside of the walls. Ice spreading across the floor and over whatever furniture was left behind in the dark. There are photographs taken inside the town of a child's crib, abandoned in an empty flat, buried under a sheet of white. One of the most haunting records of all this comes from a photographer named Evgenia Arbugaeva, who, by her own account, grew up in Tiksi and left with her family when the Soviet Union came apart. Years later, she returned to document what was still there, following the daily life of a young girl in a town that was quietly emptying around her. Her images capture something that no statistic ever could, what it actually looks like to be a child in a place the rest of the country has decided, without ever saying so out loud, to forget. And the decay is not limited to the apartment blocks. Out at the edges of the town and along the water, the heavier bones of the Soviet project have simply been left where they stopped working the rusting hulls of ships that will never sail again, the stripped carcasses of old aircraft slowly being taken apart by the weather, an entire industrial machine switched off and abandoned to the cold, too expensive and too remote for anyone to ever bother hauling away. But the people leaving is only half of what is unmaking Tiksi. The other half is happening directly underneath it. The entire town is built on permafrost ground that is supposed to stay frozen permanently, forever. That rock-hard frozen earth is the only thing holding the foundations in place. The engineers who designed these buildings, decades ago, made one quiet assumption that felt completely safe at the time, that the permafrost would always stay frozen. They built for a world that no longer exists, because it is not staying frozen. As the Arctic warms, the ground that anchors every building is slowly softening, and softening ground loses its ability to carry weight. One survey of Russian Arctic infrastructure estimated that around 1 in 5 of Tiksi's buildings were already in a potentially dangerous condition, and that assessment was made before the worst of the recent warming had even arrived. The very same cold the town was built to defy turns out to have been the only thing keeping it standing. Sit with that for a moment. The Arctic is not destroying Tiksi by being too harsh. It is destroying Tiksi by becoming, very slightly, less harsh than it used to be. And that same thaw has cracked open something almost impossible to believe. As the frozen tundra around the region softens, it begins to give up what it has held for tens of thousands of years, including the tusks of mammoths preserved in the ice since the last ice age. Researchers have documented that the warming Arctic has opened up a trade in mammoth tusk, collecting, pulled straight out of ground, that used to be solid all year round. The same warming that is splitting the foundations of the town is also turning the surrounding tundra into a kind of vast frozen vault, slowly clicking open. Which brings us to the part of this story that should not make any sense at all. Because just as Tiksi was settling into its long silence, half empty, half frozen, almost completely forgotten, the rest of the world started circling back toward it. The reason is the very same one that built it in the first place, the Northern Sea Route. For almost all of recorded history, the Arctic passage along Russia's coast was sealed shut by ice for most of the year, useless to anyone in a hurry. But as that ice retreats, the route is transforming into one of the most strategically valuable corridors on the planet. A container ship leaving China can reach the ports of Northern Europe through the Arctic far faster than by sailing all the way down and around through the Suez Canal, cutting thousands of kilometers off the journey. In October of 2025, Russia and China signed a sweeping agreement to develop this Arctic passage, together the cold backbone of what they have begun calling the Polar Silk Road. Cargo moving along the route has been climbing toward record levels, with Chinese container ships making voyage after voyage through waters that, until just a few years ago, were considered impassable to ordinary vessels. There is a hard logic driving this. With much of its trade with the West cut off, Russia has turned sharply toward Asian markets, and the Arctic route is its shortest thread to them. For China, the appeal is speed and security, a passage that sidesteps the crowded, contested choke points far to the south. Traffic that was once measured in a handful of experimental voyages now runs into the tens of millions of tons of cargo a year. A frozen frontier is quietly turning into a commercial reality, and Tiksi sits directly on that route. On paper, it is exactly the kind of place that ought to matter again, a deep harbor in a near-perfect position on the most important new shipping lane in the world, doubling as a military outpost and a base for search and rescue. Almost overnight, the forgotten town became, in the careful language of strategists, a dual-use asset. Here is where the whole story turns, one final time. Because being strategically vital and being saved are not remotely the same thing. The analysts who track Russia's buildup in the Arctic have pointed out something deeply uncomfortable. The grand plans announced for Tiksi, the advanced air defense systems, the new structures, the full expansion that would turn it back into a stronghold, have largely failed to materialize. Satellite images do not show the systems that were promised. The reconstruction has fallen far, far behind the speeches. It is not that nothing arrived at all. An air defense unit was in fact placed near the town a few years ago, a genuine sign of renewed military interest. But the far larger force that was announced, the next generation systems, the row of new buildings, the fully rebuilt Stronghold, has stubbornly refused to appear in the satellite record. The announcements were grand. The concrete was not. Tiksi has become important again the way a name on a map is important. The ships are coming back to the route. They are not coming back to the town. And that is the quiet cruelty buried in a place like this. The thing that gave Tiksi life was never the Arctic, and it was never even the people who chose to live there. It was a decision, made thousands of kilometers away, that this one spot on the map was worth paying for. When that decision was made, 11,000 people had a city, a home, a future. When the decision was quietly unmade, those same people were left holding nothing but a place to leave. And now that the map has decided, once more, that Tiksi matters, the decision is about the route that passes by it, not the lights in its windows. Tiksi is not alone in any of this. All across the Russian Arctic there are towns built on exactly the same logic, by the same hand, for the same single reason, and now hollowing out on the same brutal timeline. Cities that were never really cities in the way we normally use the word. They were positions, held for precisely as long as someone, somewhere, was willing to pay the bill to keep them. They didn't lose Tiksi to the ice. They simply stopped paying for it. So here is the question worth carrying with you. If a place can be strategically essential and almost completely empty at the very same moment, if the most powerful nations on Earth can want the frozen ground beneath a city without wanting the city at all, then was Tiksi ever truly a home? Or was it only ever a flag, planted at the top of the world, waiting quietly to see how long anyone would bother to keep it flying? Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you on Impossible Lands.